On May 2, 1968, two six-man U.S. Special Forces teams were trapped behind enemy lines during a secret mission. They faced heavy gunfire from hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers. The helicopter crews who tried to rescue them were badly hurt. 3 helicopters crashed and 4 Special Forces soldiers died. 8 wounded men remained alive, running out of bullets and bleeding heavily. Back at the Army base, a young Green Beret soldier named Roy had just woken up. He was new to the base, arriving just one day before. He skipped breakfast to check on the damaged helicopters that had crash-landed. When Roy asked about the names of the men trapped in the fighting, his heart stopped. His friends were out there in danger. A helicopter engine started up. Roy grabbed a medical bag and jumped into the departing aircraft without thinking twice. During the flight, Roy realized he had no rifle, no pistol, and no protective gear, only his knife and medical supplies. Roy would be the only hope for those 8 surviving men. This begins the incredible story of Roy Benavidez and his 6 hours of hell in Vietnam. Born August 5, 1935 in Texas, Roy lost both parents before age 7. His father died of tuberculosis when Roy was 3, and his mother died when he was 6. His stepfather rejected him, so his uncle Nicholas adopted Roy and his younger brother. Nicholas and his family, including Roy's grandfather Salvador, loved Roy like their own children. The family was proud of their Mexican and Yaqui Indian background. During the 1940s and 1950s, when racial tensions divided America, Roy's family still showed pride for their country. "You are Mexican," his grandfather Salvador said, "but we are American." Salvador often told stories with important lessons. After telling one story about rescuing a fellow cowboy who fell over a cliff, he would tell the children, "If someone needs help, you help them." These words would guide Roy's actions on May 2, 1968. From childhood, Roy dreamed of becoming a paratrooper. He was inspired by newsreels showing American paratroopers jumping into combat zones across Europe during World War II. While America celebrated victory in Europe in May 1945, most Americans had never heard of a small Southeast Asian country called Vietnam. Unknown to young Roy, American forces had already begun secret operations in Vietnam. The U.S. wanted to help Vietnamese fighters defeat Japanese forces still occupying much of Indochina. They provided weapons and military training to local Vietnamese guerrilla forces, including those led by Communist leader Ho Chi Minh. Although Roy's family was rich in love, life was not easy for the Benavidez family. Parents and children worked together in sugar beet and cotton fields under the hot summer sun. This tough childhood made Roy a tough kid. By age 7, he was used to settling arguments with his fists. Like many American boys, Roy admired the men in the armed forces who fought in World War II. His hero was Audie Murphy, the most decorated soldier of the war. Roy discovered Murphy was like him, raised in Texas and picked cotton just like the Benavidez family. With his uncle's blessing and seeing Audie Murphy on recruiting posters, Roy enlisted in the Texas National Guard at age 17. After finishing basic training, his uncle asked if it was difficult. "Better than changing tires," Roy responded, referring to his former job at an auto repair shop. 2 years later, Corporal Benavidez wanted to join the Army full-time, become a paratrooper, and bring honor to his family name. After graduating from boot camp, he attended advanced infantry training, hoping it would help him get into Airborne, the legendary fighting force of World War II. However, his Army recruiter had not been completely honest. Instead of going to airborne school, his first assignment sent him overseas to Korea. The Korean War had ended, so Roy worked security detail along the border between Communist North Korea and anti-Communist South Korea. In 1956, his next assignment was Berlin, West Germany, where the Berlin Wall divided Germany in two. Roy saw the effects of post-World War II communism firsthand. He returned home for short leave, visiting his loving family and dating his sweetheart Ilaria Lala Coy. They got engaged at the end of 1958. With his first enlistment ending, Roy still dreamed of going airborne. The MP school was located at Fort Benning, Georgia, home of the Army's Airborne Jump School. Roy was closer to making his dreams come true. Despite having 2 previous applications to jump school denied, Roy was offered an assignment as security escort for the visiting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, General William C. Westmoreland. Roy jumped at the opportunity. The general took a friendly liking to young Benavidez and asked him, Tell me, Sergeant, have you ever thought about going airborne? Yes, sir, ever since I was a kid. I just want a chance, sir. You must want to go pretty bad. Yes, sir. 2 months later, Roy found an authorized invitation to attend jump school. He was in. Several weeks later, with silver airborne jump wings shining proudly on his uniform, newlywed Roy and his wife Lala moved to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division. While regional violence in Indochina had continued since World War II ended, November 1963 would be remembered for two major world events. On November 2, 1963, the president of South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, was killed during a military coup encouraged by U.S. Central Intelligence Agency agents. Like his South Vietnamese counterpart, U.S. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated only 20 days later on November 22. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson immediately became president. Under President Johnson's leadership, American efforts to stop the spread of communism in Asia increased. By 1965, the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, known as the Vietcong, VC, had become firmly established. Tunnels had been built for years, hiding much of their growing strength under the soil of South Vietnam. These tunnel systems helped VC fighters conduct secret operations and terrorist attacks. Their growing strength was partly due to these terrorist acts. Recruitment by fear was effective. If a young man refused to join the Vietcong, he would be made an example. At best, he might lose a finger. At worst, his head would be displayed on a bamboo stake. As America began sending tens of thousands more troops to Vietnam toward the end of 1965, Roy moved with his now pregnant wife back to her parents' home in El Campo, Texas. Roy had received orders to Vietnam as a military advisor assigned to the South Vietnamese Army Unit, the 25th Infantry Tigers. Roy had a target on his back the moment he arrived in the country. Death and tragedy were routine parts of his experiences in Vietnam. With the widely accepted political reason for U.S. involvement being to stop the spread of communism, Roy's view of the Vietcong was no different from his view of the Nazis and Japanese in World War II. While he knew he had to be careful of Vietnamese locals, his opinion toward them was different. Though some fellow soldiers viewed these villagers as backward, these mothers, fathers, and children working hard in the hot heat reminded Roy of his own family and childhood. During his first deployment to Vietnam, Roy spent much time coordinating the building of shelters and camps for refugees fleeing Vietcong violence in the mountain highlands. Roy often returned to these camps to provide security for these defenseless families. One day, Roy accompanied a security patrol back to a refugee camp, an experience that would haunt him for life. As he got closer to the camp, he immediately knew something was wrong. He could hear screaming. Moving quickly around a building he had helped construct as shelter for refugees, Roy found himself facing 3 young children, 2 boys and a girl. They had been crucified, their small hands and feet nailed to the outer wall. Their once perfect bodies were now destroyed by bullets. The VC had used them for target practice. Roy's future nightmares were filled with the screams of 2 women, the children's mothers, who knelt before the children in agony. A man, likely the children's father or grandfather, knelt beside them, mourning quietly. Roy went on another jungle patrol in late January 1966. Some accounts say this was a solo patrol where Benavidez wore a stolen Vietcong uniform, possibly trying to prevent VC snipers from killing him during reconnaissance missions. As he hunted down Vietcong fighters, Roy had learned quickly to blend in. He learned how to move quietly in the dense jungle, avoid booby traps, and avoid giving himself away to VC snipers with even the smallest careless gestures. Unfortunately, the Vietcong set their traps well. Moving through dense brush on that patrol in late January, Roy would not remember what happened next. His world suddenly went dark. Whatever hit Roy, possibly a landmine that failed to fully explode, something heavy suddenly slammed hard into his back with hundreds of pounds of force. The impact severely damaged his spine, creating a mess of broken bone and cartilage. The explosive force also slammed his brain hard against the inside of his skull. Considering he was apparently alone on this patrol, he was lucky to be found. Some accounts say a group of Marines found him first, mistaking him for a dead VC fighter before seeing he was a Hispanic man wearing American dog tags. When Roy finally woke up several days later, he found himself in a bright room he didn't recognize, thousands of miles away from Vietnam. He was back in Texas. When he could finally open his eyes, he woke one day to find a green-eyed woman with dark hair sitting next to his hospital bed. "It's Lala," she told him. He looked at her, then at the bump on her belly. He had last seen his pregnant wife only 3 months ago. Now he had no idea who she was. Roy had lost his memory. Lala never stopped visiting and praying for her husband to recover. Despite suffering complete memory loss for several weeks, Roy would eventually regain much of his memory and mental functions. But the temporary fog was a blessing in disguise. Roy was found screaming and crying in his hospital bed one morning. His memories were returning. Despite lying in a Texas hospital, he could see those 3 crucified children as clearly as if he was back in the refugee camp. As his mind settled, Roy's focus returned to his commitments, those of his family, his country, and his surviving brothers who needed him back in Vietnam. Due to his paralyzed legs and brain injury, he knew the army would find him unfit for continued duty. The doctors had already started the discharge paperwork. Staring at his withered legs, he cursed them often, wishing they had been blown off. While other young men were doing everything they could to avoid military service, Roy was devastated by the thought his army career might end. With doctors pressuring him to accept discharge from the army, for the first time in his life, Roy began to beg. He pleaded with them to give him more time. One evening in March 1966, 2 months after arriving at the hospital, an angry Roy dragged himself off his bed, crashing to the hard floor. From there, he began to crawl. Every night when nurses wouldn't be there to stop him, he would slowly pull himself up between nearby nightstands, pressing his back to the wall. Then, feeling unbearable stabbing pains shoot through his back, he attempted to put weight on his legs. As nurses repeatedly found him sprawled on the floor, with wounded men around him cheering his efforts, they finally agreed to send him to therapy. After only a week, Roy stood exhausted and in tears between the nightstands. He could bear his own weight again. By early summer, Roy had prevented his medical discharge and was working as an administrative assistant back at Fort Bragg, North Carolina with the 82nd Airborne Division. He was happy to still be in the Army, but Roy knew he wasn't cut out for desk work. He needed to be back in the field. Far from losing sight of his dreams, Roy had his heart set on becoming a Green Beret ever since learning about this distinguished Army Special Forces group. Like other Special Forces units, Marine Corps Force Recon, Navy SEALs, and Army Rangers, the training was extremely demanding both physically and mentally. Few who applied ever earned their Green Beret. The Green Beret motto, De Oppresso Liber, to free the oppressed, stuck in Roy's mind through his desk work. He obsessed over the atrocities he had witnessed, those crucified children in Vietnam. He had to do something. He had to go back. Despite multiple denials of his requests to requalify for active jump status due to his injuries, Roy's newly acquired administrative skills had taught him how to forge an authorization slip. In September 1966, after some smooth talking, he boarded an aircraft with a parachute on his back. His wife was not impressed, but Roy persisted. He began to jog, then to run. Days became weeks, and less than a year from the day he entered the hospital in Texas, Roy Benavidez was ready. During the summer months of 1967, Roy pushed himself through the rigorous Special Forces qualification course in the North Carolina heat. He learned to operate as part of a standard 12-man Special Forces A-team. Each man was cross-trained in their teammates' duties, navigation, weapons, demolitions, communications, intelligence collection, and combat medicine. As with his previous setbacks, Roy refused to quit or show any signs of weakness. On September 29, he and his teammates made the cut. Roy was honorably presented with his Green Beret, a moment he would cherish for the rest of his life. Toward the end of 1967, American and South Vietnamese forces were certain the enemy couldn't withstand the attack forever. North Vietnamese Communist leader Ho Chi Minh strongly disagreed. In Vietnam, the Green Beret mission was similar to Roy's previous deployment as an advisor. Each A-team would provide training to local counterinsurgency groups, teaching these fighters how to defend themselves against pro-communist violence. They also conducted patrols and reconnaissance, sending intelligence back to headquarters in Saigon. For the Green Berets, it was highly dangerous work. Following President Johnson's approval, U.S. Special Forces units had been conducting top-secret reconnaissance missions over Vietnam's western border. They discovered that large numbers of enemy soldiers had been hiding in Cambodia. Cambodia was being used by communist fighters to harbor their troops, supplies, and weapons. They would use their Cambodian installations to launch attacks against South Vietnamese forces, then flee back across the border. In late January 1968, the North Vietnamese Army and Vietcong launched a massive attack against South Vietnamese forces, hoping to overwhelm the unsuspecting American and South Vietnamese troops. Launched on the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, Tet, this became known as the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive lasted nearly 8 months. Americans and South Vietnamese forces suffered heavy casualties but pushed back hard against the enemy offensive, killing more than 32,000 enemy troops and capturing another 6,000. Despite the military victory, American media labeled the Tet Offensive as a political defeat. Media reporting exponentially increased growing discontent across the American home front. Anti-war demonstrations suddenly increased in intensity. With classified operations needing to remain hidden from both the enemy and public eye, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, MACVSOG, a covert unit of predominantly Green Berets along with Navy SEALs, Force Recon Marines, and Army Rangers, was best suited for the job. The mission, codenamed Daniel Boone, had begun in April 1967, operating out of secret bases near the Cambodian border northwest of Saigon. A year later, back at Fort Bragg in April 1968, Roy Benavidez began hearing word of the covert operation from his Green Beret friends who were just returning from deployment. Roy was then informed of the death of his friend, a fellow Green Beret Stefan Mazak, who was killed in a firefight along the Cambodian border. Having received orders back to Vietnam a month prior, Roy immediately told his sergeant major to change them. He wanted in on the Daniel Boone mission. Some of his brothers were still there. Only a few days later, 2 six-man reconnaissance teams would find themselves deep in Cambodian territory, their secret mission severely compromised, the men pinned down under relentless firepower of hundreds of enemy fighters. Those men's lives would soon depend entirely on one man, on Roy Benavidez. The incredible story of Medal of Honor recipient Roy Benavidez and his heroic actions during 6 hours of hell in Vietnam on May 2, 1968.